So we're going to talk a little bit about reducing bias in the selection process, right? So how do you reduce bias? So why do I say reduce bias and not eliminate bias? It is my belief that we never get rid of bias because bias is a part of the context that we grew up in, right? So I have these biases. What I can do though is illuminate those biases. In some cases, I can reassign them meaning or reassign them to something else. Or I can reduce them, right? And so I'm going to speak mostly in this particular section about how we reduce our biases, particularly in the selection process, right? So how do we reduce our bias? Not necessarily eliminate it, but how do we reduce it? And so when we think about this interview process, what are those stages in the interview process, right? So typically we get a list of applicants, or even before that, right? So we send out the job description. So who and how is that job description written, right? So it is interesting that this implicit bias can creep itself even in our job description, the job posting rather, the job posting or the job description that we send out to people, right? And so there's tons of research that talks about how a job posting or a job description is written greatly impacts the gender of those people who apply, right? And so when we think about this whole interview process, it becomes important to recognize, is there gender bias even in our postings or our job descriptions? Is there gender bias in that, right? Is it male driven or is it female driven in our postings? And so there are tools like Textio, which is a set of AI tools that you run a job description through, and it'll tell you how gendered your job description or your posting is, right? And so that leads, just starting off the blocks that way gets us into an important conversation around this implicit bias that is implicitly embedded in our processes. And so people will make decisions based on that before they even come to an interview. And then we typically have either a phone screening, we have an applicant pool, and we go through all this process. We do an interview, we kind of whittle that down. We may do some job analysis or work analysis or portfolio analysis, a job offer, and then folks go to orientation, right? So this is an overall process, not just one particular activity. So let me move this over here just for a second. So here's some tools that you'll find in this particular session. So we'll talk about common identity formation, perspective taking, considering the opposite, counter stereotype exemplars, and then lastly, focus on the primary goal. So when we think about common identity formation, what we know, many of us have either been in the military, or we've heard conversations by military people, or even seen movies that kind of dealt with this particular topic. And they say that in the military, they do not want people fraternizing with the enemy, right? So this idea of fraternizing with the enemy, what does that mean, to fraternize with the enemy? That means not to be too friendly with the enemy. Why? Because you may have to take a negative course of action with an enemy. You may have to treat them like an enemy, right? And so when we think about that, what's the opposite of that? How do I So what's the opposite of not fraternizing with the enemy? Obviously, fraternizing with the enemy. Why? So you can become friends with them. And so sometimes when we go into job interviews, it feels almost like, particularly from, and I mean this in the best of ways, it feels almost like a combatant relationship, right? So I'm trying to convince you of something, and yeah, sometimes it just feels like that, right? And so something that is oftentimes helpful is if we can find something in common with the applicant. If I can look at this applicant either in our small talk before the interview starts or as the interview is going, I start trying to see things from either their perspective or things that we have in common. Because the more I can see this applicant as similar to me or like me, the level of unconscious bias goes down considerably, right? It goes down considerably. And so in the small talk part of your interview, ask questions about their interests, about their activities, right? We're not trying to violate any EEO or OSHA or FERPA or you don't want to violate any of those questions, but you do want to try to find some commonalities with the folks that you're interviewing, because that will greatly decrease your unconscious bias. And so what we know is that commonalities bring people together, right? So the more we have in common, the more likely we are to make connections. And I'm able to see this person as someone who's like me, or at least be able to look at their stories, their situations as something that is familiar to me, and not something that is a combative, opposite, different perspective, right? So I can see their perspective as being very similar to my own. And so gather perspectives, try to understand a situation from their point of view, develop empathy with the participant, with the applicant, and gain an appreciation for what they've gone through, right? So, sometimes, and I don't know if this has happened to you, we may have things on our resume that we put on there because we didn't want to have a gap, but I may have had a rough time at a particular place. Ask about that. Find out if there are lessons that the person has learned through some of those gaps or those hard times that they've had in their in as a part of their story, right? Because it's not having gone through hard times that is bad. It's being stuck in hard times, right? It's not learning from things that you've done. And so gather lots of perspectives. Are there ways to look at an applicant's challenges as something that added strength to their character, right? So that becomes important. So gather many perspectives. Consider the opposite. So keep in mind. Now, this is something that I think is very interesting. So how many of you have done something bad? Bad, not good, right? So by whatever means you measure that, right? However you measure that, have done something bad. Are you that bad thing that you did? Are you that bad thing that you did? And most of us would say, no, I'm not that bad thing, right? So it is something that I did. It's something that I learned from. I will not repeat that thing again. But it is something that I did and that I learned from, right? So the same thing it should be said about applicants. Now, again, this is a conversation about how to reduce your bias in the interview process. And so keep an open mind, right? So before reaching a final conclusion, review all the evidence to convince yourself the opposite. So as an example, despite a poor review, might there be additional evidence that supports them as being a good candidate? So, say you did one of those calls and the person said, well, I don't know about Joe, da, 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 da. Is it possible that there's something about Joe that could still be seen as a positive candidate? Or do you want to just go off of that one statement, right? What I'm not asking you to do is to to hire people who aren't qualified. So this is not about qualifications. What I'm not asking you is to hire people who don't meet the minimum qualifications. That's not what I'm asking. But I am asking that sometimes there are things that happen in one's work career or one's work story that upon further conversation or digging deeper, we might recognize that that may in fact be something that I would have done, or you understand why they made those decisions as it pertained to their career or their choices, right? But you know what? Yeah, I understand why you did that, right? And what does that tell you about what they're capable of doing in your organization, right? So important. Be critical thinkers around that stuff. So just because you see something that you don't like or you're questioning doesn't mean you should just throw out a person. Just be critical in thinking. And then identify counterstereotypical exemplars. So this is a fancy way of saying, if you see something that you think fits one of your own biases or your own stereotypes, right? Think about others or other people that don't necessarily fit that stereotype that you have, right? So spend time with people from groups that you have no experience with or may hold negative stereotypes about. So hang out with those people, right? So get to know those people that you may not have encountered ever in your life, that you may hold a negative stereotype. Now, this is going to require a level of earnestness, of humility and transparency to yourself. I don't, as an outside observer, I don't ever have to know these things, but these are things that only you know that you have to do, right? And so whatever that group is, try to figure that out. Identify admirable characteristics within that group. So the group is normal. Is it possible that this could be extended to this individual too, right? This is like the flipping of the, I don't like those people, but I like you. So it's kind of flipping that a little bit to say that maybe there's things about this group of people that also could be extended to this individual, even though I don't know them yet, right? And then connect with different ideas and work to understand each other, right? So just challenge yourself to think about the world from a different point of view, particularly from their point of view. And so some of this work is work that has to be done before you get to an interview so that you're prepared when you get to that interview. Or if you've done an interview and you now recognize, oh man, I have this bias or this unconscious bias in this area or that area. You know what? I need to do something, because here's the interesting thing about passing life's tests. If you don't pass life's tests the first time, life will present them to you again, right? So take these pointers, because the situation will present itself again and you don't want to be caught unawares. And then lastly, we can't forget to focus on our primary goal, right? So why am I hiring this person? What is it that the organization needs? Now, here's the thing that's really interesting. When we have outlined what the organization needs, and I have an interviewee or an applicant in front of me, when I'm focused on the goals, I might suggest an applicant that I don't like because they have a skill set that the organization needs, right? So me liking an individual that I'm interviewing actually has little to do with what the needs of the organization are, unless I'm the organization, right? So focus on your primary goals. So commit to attracting, retaining, and learning as team members, attracting those people. Ensure the primary goal can be achieved, and focus on long-term organizational goals. And so this person may not necessarily they meet the minimum qualifications. They have a great background, but I also can see potential in them 15 years in the future, 10 years in the future, right? Now, here's the other thing that sometimes we do for applicants, that this focusing on the primary goals will help us stop doing. And that actually, this should be bullet number 4. I didn't write it down, but this one's for free too, right? So sometimes we'll see a applicant that is just absolutely dynamite. This person knocks your socks off, and we'll say to ourselves, this person won't stick around. They wouldn't want this job. So let's not advance them because this job is beneath them. Let them decide. Right? So let them decide, because all too often we try to make decisions for people without giving them the opportunity to make the decision for themselves. So, yes. So you've applied for this position. It only pays this much. We know that your experience has been this much. We'd like to offer you the position. Are you willing to take it at what we're offering? That's their decision to make, right? So too often we're not focused on the primary goal of getting the most effective and impactful people in our organization, because we have, in some cases, inferiority complexes about either our organization or about ourselves. And so let those candidates make the decisions as to whether they want to be a part of our organization or not, given whatever constraints. Maybe it's a dollar constraint. Maybe it's an hour, or, a time frame, So if we're serious about doing this thing, we'll let the candidates make the decisions for themselves, and we won't make them for them. Right. So, we're going to stop right here, and then we'll come back for the next section. Thanks.